and post a link to the script into the panel 2 chat for those who want to follow along. I'll also have some links which I'll post into that chat as they're brought up. So I think we're ready to begin now. My name is Swiftpaw, and I'm in a system that's practiced soul bonding since 2016. And soul bonding was actually our introduction to the plural community coming from FictionKin. I both am a soul bonder individually, and my system has soul bonds collectively. Our experiences are a bit complicated. My system wanted to do this panel because discovering soul bonding was an important part of our journey as an alter-human system, and soul bonding as a community is one we wanted to give more recognition to, especially for its overlap with alter-humanity. This is going to be an introduction to the concept, how it's experienced and who can experience it, why people do it, and a brief overview of how to do it. We will take questions towards the end. So what is soul bonding? Soul bonding can be difficult to define because it's a term and subculture that's existed for over 25 years. It was originally coined by Amanda Flowers on the mailing list just for writers in 1998 to describe the experience of writers having living characters. By the 2000s, this term had spread to LiveJournal. It grew in popularity from there among both writers and non-writers. Around this time was also where the term got recognition in the multiplicity community, appearing in glossaries around 2003, and the Shinken community, where there was an overlap with some LiveJournal groups. This is a very brief paraphrasing on the history of soul bonding, and admittedly, a lot of it is hard to track because of many websites not being archived or pages being private. But for those looking for articles which discuss this, the now-defunct blog about soul bonding did a write-up which I'll link, and LB Lee also covers soul bonding in their plural history. I'll go ahead and get those links posted into the chat. Do we define it? There are many sources which define soul bonding, and some even contradict each other. This can make just defining soul bonding a little complicated. For a simple definition, a quote sourced from Soul Whispers defines it as follows. Soul bond, verb, to form and/or experience a robust mental or empathetic connection with one or more fictional characters. Short and simple definition, but to some alter humans, this might sound closer to something like fiction hearted or synpaths. The emphasis here is more on the connection, not the soul bond being a separate entity like with plurality. We'll get more into why that is later. Another definition I like, under the now defunct Living Library, defines it as the following. Soul bonding / living characters occur when a person, often after establishing a strong emotional connection to a fictional character, finds that said character has come to life in their mind. This new entity, called a soulbond, muse, or living character, though non-physical, is autonomous in that they are capable of speaking and acting on their own, even outside of or in opposition to the expectations of the original person, called the soulbonder or author. The soul bond essentially is, or like, a separate conscious entity co-inhabiting a brain with their soul bonder, which I think is still a solid definition to what a soul bond is. Even though not all soul bonders are writers or experience soul bonds as being like muses, it is still a subculture that's associated with it. If this sounds similar to fictive, that's because it is. Soul bonding is the subculture where the term fictive started to be used to refer to fictional characters and systems, and was originally just supposed to be a less spiritual sounding alternative to soul bond until it jumped to other communities. This can also make it difficult to give an exact difference between a soul bond and a fictive, and there isn't really a clear answer for it beyond associations. I also just realized I forgot to link to the Living Library in the chat, so I'll go ahead and do that now for those who want that reference. And so, soul bonding is arguably more host-centric and focuses on the relationship between a soul bonder and a soul bond, though this also isn't a hard rule either, as some fictives and non-host systems may still identify as soul bonds. The degree to which soul bonding is spiritual or metaphysical is also disagreed on. Some websites might define it as exclusively spiritual, while others might imply something more psychological. Soul bonds usually come from some other place and with a level of backstory, but this isn't inherently spiritual and can have a psychological cause. This is akin to how some fiction kin might have memories but not ascribe them to anything spiritual. Also a gray area when it comes to thought forms or topomancy, which is consciously creating a headmate. Some soul bonders, they may be a type of thought form, but for others, they may be closer to a walk-in or something that just happened. It is another thing, though, where not all soul bonders consider it thought forms. Regardless of all these associations and gray areas with other experiences, we can say at least that soul bonding is forming a connection to a character as someone separate from yourself to where that character is experienced as a presence in your mind. So, how is soul bonding experienced? It gets easier to understand what a soul bond is when looking at the ways it's experienced in actual practice. The way soul bonding is experienced is also varied. There are a few common trends and ways soul bonds get described within the community. Here are a few common day to day experiences of soul bonding: giving feedback, particularly on their story or character. This can be suggesting where the story should go or even arguing with the writer during the writing process. Likewise, commenting on interpretations that seem out of character or wrong to them. Giving input during day to day events, even if there's no writing or other creation going on, like suggesting clothes to wear or commenting on something funny or annoying. Providing comfort or advice to the soul bonder and vice versa, sometimes during times of stress for either the soul bond or the soul bonder. Feeling projected alongside the bonder, such as feeling like the soul bond is sitting or laying next to them or walking alongside them. The soul bond still having a full life of their own even in their own reality, sometimes coming in and out to interact with the soul bonder. Likewise, soul bonds might also exist in a headspace. Three types of soul bonds, or another way of looking at it. The Fictionkin and soul bonding website from Fiction lists three types of soul bonds, and these are useful for visualizing how soul bonds can be experienced in different ways. And I'll post that link in the chat as well. First is a permanent resident, which is a soul bond that completely moves in and is either unable to or unwilling to interact with their original world. For example, this could be a soul bond that's dead in their world, but for others it might be a choice not to go back. The second are day trippers, which are soul bonds that come and go. The way this is done might vary between systems. Some may experience it as something like astral travel, others may experience it as walking through a gate or veil. Or it may be handwave, in that either the soul bond or the soul bonder understand how it works. It could also be a mentally check-in, check-out situation. Then, internal cell phones are soul bonds that still have a mental connection while each party is doing their own thing. It's like two parallel lives coexisting where they can communicate like a shared phone line. Soul bonds in this case don't technically share a body with you. Some soul bonders with the internal cell phone type might not actually talk to their soul bonds. It can be experienced as something like looking into a window at another life. Also, why so many soul bond definitions emphasize a mental connection instead of body sharing. I've also heard the specific experience called reverse soul bonding, but it's arguably still considered just regular soul bonding, even if it's different from a typical plural experience and might not even count as plural. So what can be a soul bond? Soul bonds sometimes get divided into insourced and outsourced. Insourced are soul bonds that are not pre-existing, like original characters or non-canon characters, while outsourced are pre-existing characters, like a character from a book or a movie. Anything broadly defined as a character can be a soul bond. This is usually what separates soul bonds from other forms of spirit works or other types of walk-ins. This includes any type of fan character, OC, alternate universe, and also any character from fiction no matter what. Soul bonds can also be villains or morally gray characters. They can also be background characters. This is, once again, a gray area where some non-fictive walk-ins might be counted as soul bonds, but it's very much associated with characters and the living character phenomenon. There's also the concept of factive soul bonds, or soul bonds of real people, which is something where a lot of the information about it seems to be lost. It was originally called Body Brothers and may have been coined on LiveJournal, but that account was purged and not backed up. Here is a definition of it from the website Fictive Kin, which I'll also link. There's an additional There's an additional phenomenon related to soul bonding, that of Body Brothers, wherein the bonder has contact with someone who exists in their own reality, such as a movie star, musician, etc. This is not to say that the bonder necessarily has a psychic connection to that person. Acceptance of this occurrence depends upon the existence of alternate timelines and or parallel dimensions. From what I found, also implied this practice may have been controversial back then, and I personally wouldn't encourage it, but it's still worth bringing up that it does exist. I did also find a few archives of soulbonders who had historical figures like Oscar Wilde or Shakespeare as soulbonds, albeit more fictionalized or mythicized. Before I continue, I also want to address something I saw in the chat. Is I didn't mean to imply at all that the term fictive was stolen. It's more just like naturally shared between communities. It wasn't taken from soul bonding or anything like that. So how common is soul bonding and who can experience soul bonding? Soul bonding is very common. There's a bit of a meme about how the creator of Garfield has a Garfield tulpa, but that's actually a classic example of soul bonding. Other famous examples of soul bonds include Robert E. Howard, Edith Wharton, Philip Pullman, and Leonard Nimoy, the latter being an example of this phenomenon happening to an actor. This is common enough that it's discussed in psychology and appears in studies. A study was published titled, "I've Learned to Treat My Characters Like People: Varieties of Agency and Interaction in Writers' Experiences of Their Characters' Voices," about this exact phenomenon. There's also a Psychology Today article discussing the findings for those who can't view it or want a synopsis, which I will once again go ahead. To paraphrase, some writers report their characters as being able to have entire conversations, or experience writing as just transcribing what's happening to their characters. Here are some statistics from the article. 20% of the authors in the sample sometimes sense their characters in the room with them. 13% said their characters have full agency from the start. 27% said their characters develop agency only after a certain point in the writing process. 22% said their characters had agency sometimes, but not always. The explanation given here is inner dialogue and closer to how people might hear others' voices in their heads, and it's worth mentioning that the study doesn't examine the degrees of independence or how vivid these experiences are. A lot of this may also be close to thought forms, especially with the writers who reported characters only developing agency at a point in the writing process. Regardless, though, soul bonding or experiences like it could be considered more common than most people would first think. Another 2003 study titled "The Illusion of Independent Agency: Do Adult Fiction Writers Experience Their Characters as Having Minds of Their Own?" features historical excerpts from various writers. Here is one source from Enid Blyton. "As I look at them, the characters take on movement and life. They talk and laugh. I hear them. I don't know what anyone is going to say or do. I don't know what is going to happen. I am in the happy position of being able to write a story and read it for the first time, at one and the same moment. Sometimes a character makes a joke, a really funny one, that makes me laugh, as I type it on the paper, and I think, well, I couldn't have thought of that myself in 100 years, and then I think, well, who did think of it then?" And another from E.M. Foster. "Characters arrive when evoked, hut full of the spirit of mutiny, for they have these numerous parallels with people like ourselves. They try to live their own lives and are often in treason against the main scheme of the book. They run away, they get out of hand. They are creations inside a creation, often inharmonious towards it. If they are given complete freedom, they kick the book to pieces, and if they are kept too sternly in check, they revenge themselves by dying, and destroy it by insessential decay." The above study into the writers of their sample reported 92% of the sample having some level of independent characters. Interestingly, several writers had, by the measure of the time, higher DES scores close to dissociative identity disorder. But it was noted that they didn't seem psychologically unhealthy, nor did they have a dissociative disorder. Meanwhile, in early soulbond groups, there is also an emphasis on how this can happen with role players too, where they might start to experience this with their muse. Of course, this also expanded to include not just writers. Even though the focus here is on writers, writers aren't the only ones who have this experience, even if it's the most quote-unquote normalized among them. My system has noticed with self-shipping in particular, a lot of self-shippers will mentally date their fictional others in a way reminiscent of soul bonding. Some age regressors will also experience imaginary caregivers of fictional characters. It's possible that soul bonding might be common in other groups too, but it's not called that or given much thought. And something off script that I also forgot about is with immersive daydreaming, where some immersive daydreamers seem very close to soul bonding as well. And then when it comes to the overlap with fiction kin, it's not that unheard of for fiction kin to actually be experiencing soul bonding, since that mental connection can make it difficult to tell. Some fiction kin already experience their fictotypes through parallel lives, which could arguably fit under soul bonding in some cases. So it's not that big of a stretch that someone feeling an intense mental connection to a character can sift into soul bonding. Soul bonding did and still does overlap with fiction kin quite a lot. For example, on LiveJournal, a lot of soul bonding and fictive groups also include fiction kin and vice versa. There's a good article by Tumblr about this for fiction kin specifically, which I'll link to, and another article from the From Fiction website titled "Accidental Soul Bonding." Also, give a few experiences of accidental soul bonding myself. Struggle whenever I have to multitask to get the links. All right. Feeling like you're just transcribing your characters or your characters having a will of their own. They might come in at inopportune times, need to be haggled with to continue the story, or give feedback. Characters being needy or interacting with you in an unexpected way, such as asking you for advice, or needing help with something, or wanting to talk with you even if you don't want to talk with them. Writing, role-playing, or any other creative work with a fictional character feels more like channeling them, or everything comes fluidly, especially if it's only for certain characters. You can feel a character or fictotype almost like a ghost next to you, or being able to communicate with you. Characters can come into your mind completely autonomously, even if you're not actively trying to imagine them. Having an extreme sense of how a story or character should be, or getting offended on behalf of the character, even if it's irrational. Feeling like you could genuinely consider a character as being your friend. And then to also address, I might be a soul bonder, what do I do? Because soul bonding can be so varied, it's hard for me to say in any accurate statement what to do if this might apply to you. Maybe this is a time to start to talk to them more like people, or maybe just keep doing what you're already doing and encourage it. For my system, we were more relieved to finally have an excuse to talk to each other. A good rule of thumb to at least rule out imagination is to try talking to a suspected headmate, turn off your own mind as much as possible, and see what the response is. If there's still a response, even when you're not actively trying to come up with one, there's a good chance it might be a headmate. When it comes to dissociation, soul bonding doesn't come with any. While soul bonds can rarely take over a soul bonder's body, it shouldn't happen often enough to interfere with daily life, nor is it non-consensual. Soul bonding also doesn't typically result in issues with identity. Still link Healthy Multiplicity just in case, which is a collection of articles geared towards other types of multiplicity, for those who feel they want to explore the possibility of being a different type of multiple. You don't need to figure out everything right away. There is a large spectrum of mental experiences after all, but soul bonding is typically a healthy and sometimes beneficial experience. And there's Healthy Multiplicity in the chat. A quick pause to get a drink. So why do people soul bond? A lot of this panel so far has focused more on involuntary experiences. Soul bonding doesn't actually divide itself much into voluntary or involuntary. Some old sources may be in disagreement and say it's never done on purpose, but for modern soul bonding, there is an acceptance that it can be done on purpose. Here are a few reasons why someone might intentionally soul bond, or why accidental soul bonding might happen independent to being a writer. Companionship or a desire for a deeper connection. Some people might soul bond for friendship. Soul bonding for a relationship also isn't that uncommon, going back into what we've observed with self-shipping. And with soul bonding just because you like a character. Seeking wisdom or comfort, especially through a difficult time. Soul bonding can be something like a coping mechanism for some people, especially with getting a mutual understanding of a similar trauma or condition. Someone to bounce ideas off of or enhance some skills. It's possible for soul bonding to come from something like a writing or other mental exercise. And then, like with other fictive heavy forms of multiplicity, hyperfixations or special interests, especially if it results on something or someone being constantly on your mind. For fiction kin or different types of fictives, this might also be a way to connect with people from your canon or source. Canon being people from your exact timeline, your memories, past life, whatever takes place in, and source being people from the same broad fictional source. It's sometimes possible to soul bond to a canonmate, but it's not a good idea to expect it, since it's not always possible or that soul bond might be a very different person. Soul bonding can be done for other alter-human reasons too, like to establish or enhance a coping link, for example, or because of an archetype. All of these reasons can apply to non-fiction based experience as well, like otherkin or therianthropy, with soul bonding to one of your species. Of course, this panel isn't meant to say that you need to soul bond. However, I will be going a little into how to do it and how to do it safely. So why not to soul bond and what brings about soul bonds? First, we need to talk about why not to soul bond if planning to do it on purpose. Soul bonding is still gaining a presence in your mind, and while it's usually more metaphysical, there is always a chance of there being a risk of getting stuck with someone or making a thought form. The biggest rule of thumb is not to force it. You shouldn't go into soul bonding with a feeling of desperation or like it's something you need to do with high expectations. If you're struggling with soul bond, it's a good idea to take regular breaks and don't get upset by a lack of results. The goal isn't to make a character, but connect to a character. Soul bonding is still a two-way relationship, especially when soul bonding to help with coping. You might still need to help your soul bond in addition to helping you. On the plus side, it can create a mutually beneficial relationship, but that takes work like a real relationship. Soul bonds might also not always get along with their soul bonder, and another thing to consider if picking a soul bond are mutual interests and compatible personalities. Sometimes in practice, a soul bonder might find they don't get along with their desired soul bond. It's possible for a soul bond to be canon divergent or not what you'd expect. It's okay to drop a soul bond if it's not working out. There's also a risk of accidentally puppeting a soul bond or controlling them. It's more common if you go into a connection expecting something that the soul bond doesn't want to or can't give. This can be experienced a few different ways, and how my system I experience it is like a quote-unquote ghost thought, where we think a soul bond or headmate says something, but they don't actually. This can put a strain on the relationship too if it's not being checked for. There's a great post by the now Tumblr blog, I believe is pronounced Amaranth, that goes into this in more detail. This is a much more in-depth guide about the safety and etiquette with soul bonds, and I'd recommend reading it if you're thinking of intentionally soul bonding. How do people soul bond? If you want to soul bond, how do you do it? The guide we'd recommend, in addition to the other linked guide to soul bond etiquette and safety, is From Fiction's Soul Bonding Tips, which I'll link to. No specific way to connect to a soul bond. You could go the creative route of writing, role playing, or even art or making edits, and my system has found that self insert writing is one of the most effective methods for this. It might also involve just consuming the media of the character in question for outsourced soul bonds. I've also heard of people who do more religious or spiritual methods to summon a soul bond, like lighting candles or incense, doing a spell or ritual, or through prayer. Though for all of that, it depends on what you follow specifically, how that would work, and what safety tips you need to follow. You also don't need to do that. From the point of getting them in their mind, just try to talk to them in your mind. Over time, you might start to experience some response, even if it's faint at first. A good way to go about this is to ask questions like, what do you want to eat, or what is your opinion on this movie? Once again, taking breaks and trying not to force anything. I hope this panel was a good introduction to the concept for those who wanted it, whether figuring out if this might apply to you, being interested in doing it yourself, or just curious about what this experience is. My full citations are in the link script, and we did go a little bit faster than I was expecting, but that means we do also have time for questions. So I'll take any questions about soul bonding or my personal experiences if anyone is interested. I also saw a few other soul bonders in this panel who are welcome to add on if they want. No questions? So I'll just go down the list of the new questions real quick. Is soul bonding possible to do on animals unconsciously? I think I experienced such over the past decade. No fictionals though, but animals. I wouldn't personally count that as soul bonding. That might be closer to just establishing a spiritual connection to something, but that's not something I know as much about. Like, if we're talking about real, uh, like, physical world animals. Uh, and then I would love it if you could talk about the connection between soul bonding and immersive daydreaming slash maladaptive daydreaming. So it's a case where both communities came about sort of separately. So I think they probably do have quite a lot in common, but at through most of Soulbond as a term's lifespan, there wasn't much awareness about immersive daydreaming. I think soulbonding can definitely happen because of immersive daydreaming, and there is actually a similar term coined within maladaptive daydreaming called verit bond. But it there definitely is probably a connection there, and I wouldn't be surprised if, especially with immersive daydreaming focused more on fictional works, if that could result in some kind of soul bond. Someone also asked if I could explain what soul bonding is again in simple terms. So it's just pretty much forming a connection to a character into where they exist as a separate presence in your mind. And oh, this might be connected to the maladaptive daydreaming question. I think I accidentally soul bonded to a parative who used to have his own consciousness, act independently, and interact with the area around me, like you mentioned, sensing them in the room with you. But he doesn't feel independent anymore. Is that possible soul bonding, or would that be a permanent process? Since you mentioned imperative, it's worth mentioning that this can kind of get a little weird when it comes to other types of systems. That can definitely happen with other forms of headmates, but it's not something that happens as often with soul bonds. Or let me make sure I read this question correctly. Yeah, that I might be closer to a thought form or just a regular para in that case, but I don't know enough about your situation to really say for sure. Usually soul bonds don't lose independence, they just might start to wane a bit. And then I have a weird question. Is it possible to have some kind of soul bond because you were able to see the character a long time ago, but you can't see them anymore, but you feel really connected to them? I'm not sure if I completely understand this question, but um, I don't see why it wouldn't be possible to have a soul bond like that. Uh, and then if you want to clarify that in another comment, I can go ahead and look at that. But I'll move on to the next one, which is you say that Garfield is actually an example of soul bonding. Is there a clear line between the two? Or is it possible that there may be experiences that would fall under both labels in the technical? What things make that label more accurate for the situation as we understand it? Edit, does the sequence of story or character coming first play a part? Thoughtful about chicken egg situations. So I count it more as soul bonding based on what I've seen from that creator, and that he didn't attempt to consciously create Garfield. That character just sort of appeared. But there is definitely a gray area between the two, and for some people, soul bonding might be a type of thought form or be closer to tulpomancy. I probably shouldn't have worded it like it's actually soul bonding because you don't know exactly what's going on in a person's mind, but it is still something that would count as soul bonding, and I'd probably lean more towards soul bonding instead of assuming tulpomancy. The sequence of a story or character coming first also doesn't usually matter. Some people might experience it one way or the other. It really depends on the situation of the soul bonder. And then the next question is soul bonding only for fictives? Technically, yes, but I've also seen some soul bonders use it to refer to non. It honestly depends on what exactly you want to define as a fictive or a character within soul bonding. It's just more associated with the living character phenomenon. Uh, so the next question, is there anything potentially unhealthy or delusional about soul bonding? Is it possible to revive a fated soul bond? Honestly, with anything, it is possible for experiences to go more into delusions. Potentially, it's the same thing with alter humanity, with being non-human, like the line between clinical lycanthrope or Therian. So there is always the potential for that. I don't know as much about delusions to really speak on or confidently say what the line is or when that might be something to consider. In general, I'd say soul bonding shouldn't cause distress, and if it does, it might be worth to look into other reasons. And then for is it possible to revive a faded soul bond? Yes, it should be. I've heard of a lot of people who had soul bonds when they were younger. That connection eventually faded, but they were able to bring it back. Would soul bonding be the same as practicing modern tulpomancy? It's a bit of a gray area, but in general, I'd say it's not the same thing, even if some soul bonds can be thought forms. Soul bond isn't inherently psychological. It can be something more spiritual, or it can also be. It might not be about the act of creation for creating a character, but the character just kind of comes to you more than anything. So it's again in a bit of a gray area. Someone also mentioned factive soul bonds, which yeah, it gets into kind of a gray area between fictive and factive, honestly, with if they count as soul bonds. It's not a subject I know as much about, as I'm not in a system with any factives, nor do we have much experience on it. But it does exist and has been recorded at least. Could you elaborate more on soul bonding with architropy? So this is kind of something that someone in my system experienced, but hasn't elaborated on it too much for me personally. I think the way it works is like having an archetype as someone who works with people or someone who potentially works with a certain uh, type of like spirit or entity is what I was thinking, like having a protector archetype or something along those lines. I thought it was worth mentioning that it can be connected to that as a different type of like alter human connection. I'm gonna probably skip over some of the questions about the difference between like voluntary creating a soulbond and a tulpa because it's just a gray area. It's really a case where both communities originated completely separately. Okay, so this may be a bit off track, but are there any good ways to distinguish between soulbond slash maladaptive daydreaming and actual spiritual religious experiences? Honestly, it's hard to tell a lot of the time. I say with like daydreaming, at least you can usually consciously control it, while with soul bonding you can't. But as far as like the difference between like psychological and spiritual or religious, it's really hard to tell, and I don't have a good rule of thumb beyond just how you personally understand it and what you personally observe in your own experiences. Are there any differences between a soul bond and a headmate? No, not really. Soul bonds can be a type of headmate. It also kind of depends on how you define headmate. But I want to say headmate was. I did find somewhere that claimed that headmate was coined within soul bonding, but I don't know if that was actually the case. But either way, soul bonds can be considered a type of headmate, at least. Can a tulpa blend into a soul bond through reliance? I don't know what that means in this context, but I'd say yes, there can be a case where like tulpa and a soul bond can kind of blend together. Would you say there's any difference between soul bonding versus being a gateway system with walk-in fictives? Is it just a matter of terminology and the associated communities? Yeah, it really just comes down to terminology and then like the different communities. As I said, soul bonding is usually considered more host centric, but that's, as I also said, not a hard rule. For our system, we did consider most of our walk-in fictives to be soul bonds at a certain point, but we personally stopped identifying as that, as it was easier for us to focus on soul bonding as something we experience as individuals or experience through our broadly host body. But if I I'd say that could still count as soul bonding with walk-in fictives if they choose to identify as such. What do you do if you interact with people in real life as a soul bond? Same as any other mate, probably. Uh, I don't completely understand the question here. I don't think well, soul bonds can front and take control of the body, but I don't think there'd be too much of a major difference with that between like other forms of headmates. So next question: Is there a differentiation in soul bonding, like mental and spiritual? Kind of. It's really depends on the community if this is a big difference or not. I I did, and I will still compare that to something like Fictionkin, where soul bonding, or well, where Fictionkin can get divided into psychological and spiritual, and in some groups that might be more important, but for others it might not really matter as much. Like I know websites like the Living Library included both uh, psychological and spiritual, and I've also seen websites that maybe lean towards uh, it being a mental phenomenon and others that lean more towards it being a spiritual phenomenon. I think the modern community leans more towards it as spiritual, but it's again kind of what I compare it to is like how with therianthropy the earth and animal definition got pushed, but it there are still like theriomythics or therians that don't fit that specific definition. And then, what thoughts do you have on organizing your life with soul bonds and functioning as a group? I'm trying to figure that out for myself, but most advice for other types of systems don't really apply to me. Honestly, what's helped us the most is just writing things down. Like trying to record all our headmates and trying to potentially record any interactions that happen to kind of like help us start to understand it. It's really hard to give like a quick or like without thinking about it, give a general advice on how to organize like any type of plurality because it really depends on your situation and what's going on. But yeah, definitely writing things down off the top of my head is probably one of the best methods you could go with. At least get to start getting organized and then figuring out where to go from there. Just having like a list of who everyone is can already be very helpful. And then from there, it depends on like what you mean by organizing. Like if you mean like switching, that might be a whole other thing, or if it's like just organizing things within your head. So next question, what would having a dragon guide residing in your head be considered? I know they're not tulpa or thought form because he is not. I was also told by a few people that's relatively rare for a spirit guide to be born with you instead of already existing. I can't join the call because I'm getting ready for work, so if someone could ping me here, that I'd be eternally grateful. I'll go ahead and actually save this, and I'll ping my response to you later. But I'd consider that to be more still a spirit guide, probably. Uh, I admittedly spirit guides aren't completely an area I know about, but yeah, that sounds closer to just a spirit guide to me. And then I've heard you use the term thought form a couple times now. Could you define that? So thought form is basically a entity that's created within the mind. It's a very broad term, but it includes stuff like tulpomancy, daemonism, or servitors. And then the next question, what would soul bonding look like when you've got aphantasia? I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't actually know for sure if anyone wants to reply to that. Uh, because I don't know as much. I just don't know as much about that myself. So I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to share their experiences with it. And also, I couldn't find too many posts or anything that talked about that. Would you draw any parallel or overlap between soulbond and daemonism? Can you stop a soulbond from forming at all? For the first question, honestly, they are very similar in communities, I think, just with both being usually host-centric and involving, like, not usually being considered fully multiple. But I don't think they have any historical overlap that I've been able to find. But I'd say for the difference, daemonism, it's an entity created specifically within your subconscious to represent your subconscious, usually. And so any daemon you create is going to be connected to your consciousness, soul, however you want to define it. While soul bond is something separate from yourself, usually. There might be some level where that comes from your subconscious, but it's not trying to personify that or anything like that. Then, can you stop a soul bond from forming at all? Usually, yes. I don't want to say with confidence, yes, you absolutely can. But in my experience, and with most sources I've seen, just ignoring a soul bond is usually enough to stop that from happening. If it gets into thought forms, that's a little more complicated, but I'd say yes, since it's not like you're trying intentionally to create a fully autonomous, separate entity like with Tulpomancy. If a tulpa retroactively becomes a fictional character, would it still be appropriate to use the soul bond term? This happened to us involuntarily, and I haven't really heard of it happening to others. I don't actually know. I'd say soul bonds are, I don't want to say like they absolutely have to be, but they're usually more associated with like headmates who come in already as a fictional character. So I wouldn't count like a headmate becoming a fictional character as a soul bond, but that would still definitely count as a fictive at least. Uh, Also probably wouldn't stop you from using the term soul bond. It really kind of depends, I guess. That goes back into how soul bonding gets defined differently in so many different places that it can be hard to say what doesn't count as a soul bond. It, yeah, I probably lean more towards that not being a soul bond, but still just being effective. Also, reply I saw to the daemonism question. I can answer this from a daemonism perspective. A daemon is more of a role or archetype than a type of headmate. If you soul bond and they act as a daemon, they can be a daemon. Yeah, I'll second that too. Uh, Daemonism also uh, I know also as far as like identifying as plural goes, usually soul bonders, from what I've noticed, are way more likely to identify as plural than people who practice daemonism. In response to can a tulpa blend into a soul bond through reliance? I meant how tulpa turning into soul bond through reliance of the tulpa. I didn't realize my previous answer wasn't, or my previous question wasn't clear, so I'm reposting the question with hopefully a better explanation. I think that probably goes back into if a tulpa can become a soul bond. Like, maybe, but it really depends on. It's just kind of a bit complicated. I still lean more towards a no, but uh, I don't want to dismiss the idea entirely. Then, is soul bonding inherently linked to slash a form of plurality? It sounds like it can happen to singlets, like with the examples of famous authors. So I'm unsure about the relation to multiplicity and other identities. Yes, but it's also a very common form of plurality. It's a case where not every soul bonder will identify as plural or be a part of that community, but quite a few actually, I'd say, do consider it plural. Just an example of a form of plurality that's very common and way more normalized. Although worth mentioning, I don't see soul bonding usually considered inherently multiple as much. And usually the soul bond experience kind of gets a bit closer to something like median experiences. But it really depends on the soul bond and the soul bonder and their situation, how they identify. I also see the question, what do you do if you interact with external people in real life as a soul bond? I did answer, but I just wasn't quite sure what you meant by that, if you want to clarify. Someone also asks, it's been mentioned a few times, I'm not sure if it's been explained already, but what is daemonism? So daemonism is where you create something in your mind personifying your consciousness, soul, sense of self, whatever. It's usually represented by an animal, and the concept was popularized by the His Dark Materials books by Philip Pullman. Uh, I could link to, or a website I'd really recommend for learning about it if you're interested is the Daemon page. Another response I want to highlight, most daemons don't see themselves as plural because our daemons are alternative expressions of us. Is not necessarily a plural experience, though some daemons I know are median and identify their daemons as a plural headmate. That is also true. Might one consider a channeler that has regular contact with a specific entity, or a lucid dreamer's encounter with a dream character pertinent within the context of this panel, even if there isn't quite an internal connection, for lack of a better word. Apologies if this has some redundant topics already mentioned within former questions. Oh, you're good. So, I wouldn't consider that soul bonding either. Again, though, gray area, I have seen that sometimes get referred to as soul bonding, but soul bonding is more focused on, like, the specific character, like, or the experience with a character. Maybe if you consider, like, that dream character to be a soul bond, but from my understanding, that might be something different. Although this is, again, a topic I don't know as much about. I don't know too much about lucid daydreaming. I'll just say again, that might count, that might not count. It depends on the experience. Have you ever heard of evidence of a soul bond being connected to something in collective reality? Example, two people sharing soul bonds of the same character, and the soul bonds are consistent with each other in memories and such. If not, do you think that somewhat impairs the legitimacy of soul bonds in any way? So yes, I have actually heard of something like that, where two people can share a soul bond. It's something that is actually quite a bit more normalized within soul bonding, is sharing soul bonds. Although this can also be spiritual or psychological. It's not like something where it's meant to, like, it's not, it's hard to prove any spiritual concept is real in that sense. And I've also seen, psychological soul bonders be able to share two soul bonds as well as, like, a shared character in a sense. I don't, even if that wasn't a thing, I don't think that would impair the legitimacy of soul bonds in any way, because this is still something people are experiencing at the end of the day. Even if you might not agree with the spirituality behind it, there is still at least something going on. And again, I'll compare that to something like other kin or fiction kin, especially with spiritual kin. Like, it's hard to prove if you really had a past life, but people do consider themselves still as having a past life. And regardless of the explanation, they are still experiencing being non-human or being a fictional character. Is there anything else? Any good sources about median systems? The only uh, there's no really one resource we'd recommend. There's an archived wiki that had a good article on median experiences, which I can go ahead and link after the panel is done. For reference, after the panel, would you post the links you placed in chat here as well, please? Yeah, I'll do that after the panel as well. I'll go ahead and post this again in the questions chat. Uh, the also includes site towards the end. Aristotle also makes a good point where it's like gender. You can't prove that either, but being respectful of other experiences includes just believing them. That also applies to, I think, really a lot of alter human experiences in general, where it's you can't prove it, but uh, they are still at least experiencing something. Does anyone have any other questions? Oh, if you want to, I think I have actually seen that doc with all the soul bonding references, but if you want to go ahead and link it, that's fine too. My citations page is more just like the stuff that I use specifically in the article, not just a collection of soul bonding links. What is one thing you really wish to see happen with soul bonding moving forward? I'd really love for the community to start to grow again and get more recognition. I have noticed some misinformation coming in from even in other elements of the plural community. But if we could like promote soul bonders and get soul bonding into like a state where it's like a community where people can learn and share experiences and interact with other soul bonders, that would be really awesome. Because as I said, soul bonding was my system's introduction to the plural community, and it having like forums and blogs dedicated to it really helped us figure it out. Then, would you recommend soul bonding to people who would like to practice it? It's also depends, but I think soul bonding can be a pretty good experience most of the time. And so if you're thinking that if you'd like to practice it, I'd say go for it. Soul bonding, I haven't seen too many actual like risks associated with it as long as you treat your soul bonds with respect and just go in with a level head is best advice I can give. My question is, how was researching this topic? Was it difficult? Actually, yes, because so many websites contradicted each other about what a soul bond is, and there's a lot of it I noticed that's just completely lost. There was a website, I think it's soulbonding.net or soulbonding.org, which hosted a lot of essays and seemed like it would have been really helpful to have as a resource, but only the homepage was archived and nothing else was. I also find sometimes like a cool looking live journal. I'd like to go through it, but it's just sent to friends only or private. But I already came into this knowing a lot about soul bonding, so it was more just finding resources and like getting through, I guess, imposter syndrome that I was scared I was getting something wrong. If you don't mind me asking, since I'm still learning about this, is there a term that includes all non-singlet identity in the entirety of the variety of plural, multiple, median, etc. experiences? That I'd still say plural is that. That was like the original intention behind the term plural. Is it includes just all non-singlet identities, but it's just some like with daemonism, some might still consider themselves to be a singlet just with a daemon. Or plural adjacent too, that also works. Are there discords or forums or something that people can join? I did see a link to a Discord going around, but my system doesn't use Discord as much, so I can't give any recommendations. For forums, the ones I know about have been inactive for the past couple of years, and so I wouldn't really recommend those either. As far as I know, I've seen uh the most activity was soul bonding from Tumblr. But if anyone wants to link to other uh, websites where there's active soul bonding, that'd be good. But daemon would make you a system usually. No, not really. So daemons are still like a part of you, and because of that, not every person who practices daemonism will consider that to be a system. It's like considering if you'd consider like your imagination or having like a or your consciousness itself to be a system, I guess. I don't know if I explained that too well, but just some daemons might identify as plural and thus might identify as systems, but it's very rare for them to identify as systems from our experience also practicing daemonism. So we do have about 3 minutes left if anyone wants to get in any more questions. Yeah, for us as well, you can message my system if you'd like, if you have any questions or if you want any advice. Our DMs are open. I also have a bunch of like miscellaneous fun facts while researching this, but I couldn't figure out where to put them into the panel.